have a new reaction now when people say, what about Bob Dylan? It is such an honor to have been a part of his life.
You have an identity of you, and it's yourself that maybe others around aren't aware of, so you got to start over again.
The friendship of Bob, his songs, and all the good stuff, and the rest just vanished.
They were the voice of a restless decade. She lifted him up. He changed the rules. Joan Baez and Bob Dylan didn't just sing songs. They rewired what music could do. On stage, their eyes met and the air tightened. Off stage, a different story took shape. She believed in him before the world did. She brought him out, shared her crowd, and watched a quiet poet turn into a storm. Then the storm moved on. Fame pulled, freedom called. Lines blurred. In 1965, an electric guitar split a scene and a relationship. Cheers and boos crashed together, and the space between them widened. Years later, a late phone call reopened old doors. She answered with a song that cut deep and clean. Diamonds and rust turned memory into a blade. He kept moving. She kept telling the truth. They met again under strange makeup and bright lights, and for a few nights the old magic returned. But the past doesn't fade on command. This is how a love becomes a legend. A mentor becomes a muse, a partner becomes a ghost, and two names become one argument that never ends. What really happened between them, and why does it still hurt to hear? Greenwich Village in the early 1960s was more than a neighborhood. It was the beating heart of a cultural revolution. Coffee houses buzzed with music, poetry, and protest. A constant hum of ideas where young voices tried to capture the spirit of a restless nation. Joan Baez was already a star there. Her voice was unmistakable, pure, haunting, and powerful enough to silence even the rowdiest room. She was admired not only for her music, but also for her commitment to civil rights and peace, which made her one of the most important cultural figures of the moment. Audiences adored her, critics respected her, and other artists looked up to her. She stood at the very top of the folk scene, a queen of a growing movement. Into this world stumbled a scrappy newcomer from Minnesota, Bob Dylan, carrying an old guitar and words that sounded unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. His voice was raspy, raw, even off-putting to some, but his lyrics struck like lightning. They weren't just songs. They were prophecies, questions, and challenges rolled into verses. He was unpolished, but there was a magnetism that even the most seasoned performers couldn't ignore. Baez heard about Dylan before she met him. A friend played one of his early songs, and she was immediately intrigued. His writing carried a depth that seemed impossible for someone so young. When their paths finally crossed, there was an instant recognition. Baez, already adored by thousands, saw something in Dylan that others had missed. She saw potential. She saw danger. She saw brilliance. And instead of keeping that discovery to herself, she decided to share it with the world. At a major concert, in front of an audience that had come to see her, Joan Baez did something no one expected. She invited Dylan on stage. To the crowd, he was a nobody, just another kid with a guitar. But when he opened his mouth, the atmosphere shifted. His words filled the air with a sharp honesty, and the audience, many hearing him for the first time, was stunned. That moment was a turning point, not just for Dylan, but for the history of American music. From then on, their connection grew quickly. On stage, they were magnetic together. Her clear, angelic voice braided perfectly with his rough, defiant tone. It wasn't just harmony, it was chemistry. They sang side by side, often gazing at each other in ways that left no doubt about their closeness. People in the audience could feel it, even if they couldn't define it. Their duets became more than performances. They were living proof that two very different forces could collide and create something unforgettable. Off stage, the bond deepened. They weren't just professional partners. They became companions, confidants, and inevitably lovers. For Baez, Dylan was more than just another artist. She admired him, nurtured him, and believed in him before the rest of the world caught on. For Dylan, Baez offered both a stage and a spotlight. Her fame gave him access to audiences and platforms that would have taken years to reach on his own. This wasn't a relationship of equals at first. Baez was the star, Dylan the apprentice. But as anyone in that moment could sense, things wouldn't stay that way for long. He was destined to rise, and she was the one helping him climb. To outsiders, their partnership looked like a fairy tale of the folk era. Two beautiful souls united by music, love, and activism. But those closest to them knew that beneath the glow of stage lights and the applause of packed halls, there was already a tension building. Baez had given Dylan a priceless gift: her trust, her audience, her love. The question was, what would he give back in return? And as history would prove, the answer was more complicated than anyone, least of all Joan, could have imagined. The 1960s were not a quiet decade. America was restless, boiling over with protests, demands, and a hunger for change. Music didn't just live on records anymore. It marched in the streets, sat at lunch counters, and echoed across campuses. Folk singers became the unofficial messengers of a generation, and no pair symbolized that role more than Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. Together they became voices for the voiceless, artists whose songs carried both hope and defiance. Baez had already earned her place as the queen of folk. Her repertoire was filled with traditional ballads and protest anthems that aligned perfectly with the growing civil rights movement. She was unafraid to lend her celebrity to causes that mattered, from racial justice to anti-war protests. Her stages weren't just concerts, they were platforms where she reminded audiences of their collective power. When Dylan entered that world, he didn't just add another guitar. He brought a fire that matched her own, though in a different way. His lyrics weren't polished speeches. They were raw, questioning, and often unsettling. While Baez's songs soared with clarity and conviction, Dylan's words bit at the conscience of a nation. Their partnership moved quickly from the spotlight of concerts to the very front lines of history. They sang at rallies, in churches, and at marches where ordinary citizens risked their lives for equality. They weren't just celebrities showing up for photo opportunities. They were participants in a movement. In 1963, when over 250,000 people gathered for the March on Washington, history remembers Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. But the soundtrack of that day also included Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. Standing together at the Lincoln Memorial, they sang "Blowing in the Wind" to a sea of faces. It wasn't just music, it was a challenge, a demand, a hymn of resistance. For those in the crowd, the song became a rallying cry, proof that music could be sharper than any weapon and more unifying than any speech. Audiences watching Baez and Dylan in these moments saw more than just artists. They saw leaders. They were young, fearless, and willing to use their fame to press against the weight of injustice. The chemistry between them, already obvious on stage, seemed even more powerful in this setting. Side by side, their voices braided into a sound that felt unstoppable. Rumors swirled that their bond went beyond activism, that the way they looked at each other on stage was more than professional respect. Whether or not people knew the truth, the speculation only made their performances more captivating. But even in these golden years of collaboration, seeds of conflict were quietly being planted. Dylan's words were already starting to stretch beyond protest songs, reaching for something more abstract and personal. He was restless, always searching for the next line, the next sound, the next way to push his art further. Baez, meanwhile, remained deeply committed to the causes she believed in. Her music and her activism were inseparable, each feeding the other. This difference wasn't a problem yet. In fact, it made them stronger as a duo. She grounded him in the movement. He expanded her reach with his daring lyrics. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect pair, a couple united by love, music, and justice. But history has shown that when two meteors collide, the light is bright but not always lasting. As the 1960s rolled forward, the unity that had defined Joan Baez and Bob Dylan began to show its limits. To the public, they still looked like the perfect pair, the queen of folk standing proudly beside the scrappy prophet who was rewriting what a song could be. On stage, the harmonies were seamless, the gazes between them magnetic, and the applause thunderous. But offstage, the differences in their personalities and ambitions began to sharpen. They were both artists, but they were built differently, and slowly that difference grew into a chasm. Dylan was a restless soul. He was not just a songwriter. He was a shapeshifter who hated being pinned down. Every time the world tried to define him as the voice of a generation, he recoiled. He wanted freedom, not labels. He wanted to write without boundaries, even if it meant alienating the very people who had lifted him up. Baez, on the other hand, was steady in her convictions. Her art was inseparable from her activism. To her, music wasn't just about expression, it was about responsibility. She wanted her voice to help change the world, and she believed deeply in staying loyal to that mission. This difference in philosophy soon spilled into their personal lives. Joan loved deeply and openly. She had no problem declaring her feelings, supporting Dylan, and sharing her stage with him. For her, their relationship was built on trust and emotional connection. Dylan, however, was guarded. He expressed himself through songs, not through direct words of affection. He lived in a world of half smiles, cryptic lines, and an almost stubborn silence about his true feelings. Baez once described it as loving a man who could only show emotion through music. He loved her in his own way, but he loved his freedom more. Their schedules also made things worse. Dylan's career was exploding, and with each new city and tour, his circle of friends and collaborators grew. Managers, producers, and new musicians filled his orbit. Baez often found herself on the sidelines, waiting for a man who seemed increasingly distracted. Nights together became fewer. Phone calls grew shorter. She began to feel like a guest in the very world she had helped him enter. There was no single dramatic blow-up at this stage, no scandal, no betrayal that tabloids could seize on. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, the quiet kind of distance that creeps in over time until two people wake up one day and realize they're no longer walking in step. Friends close to the couple noticed the changes. Dylan was pouring himself into writing songs that were more introspective, less about the movement, and more about his own restless thoughts. Baez respected his genius, but she also noticed the cost. He was drifting inward, toward a world where she couldn't follow. Rumors swirled that Dylan had grown cold toward her, not out of malice, but because he couldn't reconcile intimacy with his need to keep moving forward. Baez, for her part, tried to stay close. She supported him on tours, stood in the wings, and reminded herself that she had always believed in him. But even she couldn't ignore what was happening. The connection that had once felt unshakable was starting to fracture. By the mid-1960s, it was becoming clear that Dylan's path and Baez's heart were moving in opposite directions. She wanted a partner who would stand with her, who would share not just the stage, but also the burden of activism and the intimacy of love. He wanted the next horizon, the next sound, the next reinvention. To him, roots felt like chains. To her, they were the very essence of meaning. That difference, philosophy versus freedom, presence versus distance, was the crack running down the middle of their bond. And soon, it would split open in a way that neither of them could ignore. By 1965, Bob Dylan was no longer the scrappy unknown Joan Baez had once pulled onto her stage. He was now a rising cultural force, the kind of artist whose every word and chord could split an audience in half. His transformation from folk prophet to rock innovator was already underway, and the speed of that change shocked even those closest to him. For Baez, the shift wasn't just about music. It was about her place in his life. What had once been a partnership began to feel like a one-sided story, and the cracks that had quietly been forming finally tore open in a way the entire world could see. The turning point came during the summer of 1965, when Joan flew to England to join Dylan on tour. She expected to continue what they had always done: stand beside him, sing duets, and share in the magic that had defined their earlier years. But this time was different. Dylan's world had changed. He was now surrounded by managers, producers, and a new circle of musicians who fed his hunger for reinvention. Rock energy pulsed through his shows, and the young folk singer who had once been grateful for Baez's spotlight seemed almost indifferent to her presence. Reports from that tour describe Baez waiting backstage, guitar in hand, hoping to be invited to sing, only to be brushed aside. She later admitted the pain openly. She had crossed an ocean to stand with him, but instead she found herself left out, sidelined in the very world she had helped him enter. What made this hurt even more was the history. Only a few years earlier, Baez had been the one to bring Dylan into the spotlight. She had used her fame to give him audiences, stages, and credibility. To her, their connection had been personal and professional, built on love and mutual respect. But now, as Dylan basked in his growing stardom, she felt invisible. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. His distance said more than any words could. For Baez, the rejection was brutal, not just as a woman in love, but as a partner who had believed in him before anyone else had. And then came Newport. At the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, Dylan shocked the folk world by walking on stage with an electric guitar and a full band. The sound was raw, loud, and unlike anything his core audience expected. What should have been a triumph turned into chaos. Some fans cheered, recognizing the brilliance. Others booed, furious at what they saw as a betrayal of the folk tradition. For many, Dylan's electric set marked the death of an era. But for Baez, standing in the crowd, the betrayal cut even deeper. This wasn't just about folk versus rock. It was about watching the man she had loved transform into someone she barely recognized. The shy, awkward poet she had lifted into the spotlight was gone, replaced by a rebellious star chasing a new identity. Later, Baez described that period as one of the most painful of her life. She felt abandoned, both as a lover and as a collaborator. She had sacrificed her own career momentum to stand beside Dylan, only to be cast aside without acknowledgement. To the outside world, it looked like just another artistic evolution. To her, it felt like the end of something sacred. She once admitted that Dylan hadn't even given her a proper goodbye. There was no clear break, no moment of closure, just silence, indifference, and the slow realization that their story was over. In truth, Dylan's decision to go electric was bigger than their relationship. It was a moment that redefined popular music, bridging folk's earnest traditions with rock's raw power. But for Baez, the revolution came at a personal cost. She wasn't just losing a partner on stage, she was losing the man she had believed in more than anyone else. For the audience, Newport was a scandal. For Joan Baez, it was heartbreak. The music world would never be the same after that night. Neither would she. Heartbreak has a strange way of reshaping an artist. For Joan Baez, the collapse of her relationship with Bob Dylan wasn't just a personal wound, it became the raw material for one of the most haunting songs of the 1970s. Years had passed since Dylan had distanced himself from her, since England and Newport, and the silence that followed. Baez had kept moving forward in her own career, continuing to sing at protests, record albums, and use her voice as a weapon for justice. But the scars never truly faded. They lingered, tucked inside her music, waiting for the right moment to be given form. That moment came a decade later, with a late-night phone call and a song that would become her signature, Diamonds and Rust. The story, as Baez has often told it, began with Dylan unexpectedly calling her in the mid-1970s. His voice, familiar yet distant, stirred up memories she had long tried to bury. The call was brief, but it was enough. Old emotions rushed back. The love, the hurt, the betrayal, and the bittersweet nostalgia for a time when they were young and invincible together. Instead of ignoring those feelings, Baez reached for her guitar. What poured out wasn't just a song, it was a confession, a reckoning, a letter she had never been able to send. Diamonds and Rust was born not out of anger, but out of the need to confront the truth of what had happened between them. The lyrics of Diamonds and Rust are as sharp as they are tender. Baez paints vivid pictures of their early days, the crummy hotel over Washington Square, the late-night talks, the sense of being bound together by dreams of music and justice. But alongside the nostalgia is a biting honesty. Now you're telling me you're not nostalgic. Then give me another word for it, she sings, calling out Dylan's tendency to deny the past. The most unforgettable line comes near the end. If you're offering me diamonds and rust, I've already paid. In those words, Baez captured the paradox of loving Dylan. He was both the diamond and the rust, brilliant, captivating and unforgettable, yet also cold, distant and corrosive. Their love had shone brightly, but it had also left scars that time couldn't erase. What makes Diamonds and Rust so powerful is that it never slips into bitterness. It's not a revenge song. It's a mirror, one Baez holds up to herself as much as to Dylan. She acknowledges the beauty of their love, even as she admits the pain it left behind. The song moves with the same mix of clarity and vulnerability that defined her career. It doesn't ask for pity. It doesn't even ask for answers. It simply tells the truth, and that's why it resonates. Fans didn't need to be told who the song was about. The imagery, the tone, and the timing made it obvious. And while Dylan never confirmed it, his faint smile and evasive comments when asked about it only added to the mystique. For Baez, writing Diamonds and Rust was cathartic. She turned her most painful memories into art that outlived the relationship itself. The song quickly became one of her most celebrated works, earning critical acclaim and cementing her reputation not just as an interpreter of songs, but as a songwriter with her own piercing voice. More importantly, it gave her agency in a story where she had often been cast as the abandoned lover. Through the song, she told her version of events, not with anger, but with the kind of honesty that makes people stop, listen, and feel. In many ways, Diamonds and Rust was Joan Baez's answer to Dylan. Not a phone call, not an argument backstage, but a piece of music that said everything words alone could not. It was her way of reclaiming the past, of showing the world that while Dylan had left her behind, he had also left her with something she could transform, and transform it she did, into one of the most timeless breakup songs ever written. What Dylan gave her, whether he meant to or not, was both Diamonds and Rust. What she gave back was a song that turned that duality into poetry, forever binding their love and their fallout in melody. By the mid-1970s, Joan Baez and Bob Dylan's story should have been over. Their love had unraveled, their careers had diverged, and Baez had already sung her final word on the matter in Diamonds and Rust. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. In 1975, Dylan reached out to Baez again, this time not with a phone call that reopened old wounds, but with an invitation that seemed almost impossible to refuse. He asked her to join him on his ambitious new project, the Rolling Thunder Revue. To Baez, the request was as baffling as it was tempting. Why would he want her there after years of distance and silence? Was it nostalgia, guilt, or simply the knowledge that their voices together still created magic no one else could replicate? Baez herself later admitted that she didn't know why she said yes, only that if she had refused, she would have spent the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had gone. When she walked into the Rolling Thunder world, it was clear this wasn't the Greenwich Village scene of the early 60s. Dylan was no longer the shy, wiry poet she had introduced to her audiences. He was now a global icon, dressed in flamboyant costumes, his face often painted with white makeup, surrounded by a chaotic entourage of musicians, poets, and hangers-on. The tour was part carnival, part circus, part artistic experiment, and it seemed to reflect Dylan's restless spirit perfectly. For Baez, it was disorienting. She felt out of place, as though she had stumbled into a play where everyone else knew their lines. Backstage, Dylan was distant, polite but cool, no longer the young man who once needed her spotlight. They spoke, but the warmth of their old connection seemed buried beneath years of history and unspoken hurt. And yet the moment they stepped on stage together, all of that disappeared. Their duets during Rolling Thunder were electric, not because of flashy lights or costumes, but because of the undeniable chemistry that still lingered between them. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind and I Shall Be Released became something more when they sang them side by side. The audiences could feel it too. Every glance, every harmony carried the weight of their shared past, a living reminder of a love story that had burned out but still left embers glowing. Baez later said that on stage, they were still us, even if off-stage they were little more than strangers. For Baez, Rolling Thunder was bittersweet. The thrill of performing alongside Dylan again reignited old feelings, but it also underscored how much had changed. He was still brilliant, still magnetic, but he was no longer hers. She had to share him with the circus that surrounded him, with the fans who adored him, with the mythology he had built around himself. Their relationship, once intimate and private, was now just another part of the Dylan legend, a subplot in a story that belonged as much to history as it did to them. Still, those performances gave Baez something valuable. They allowed her to close a chapter that had remained unfinished. She had loved Dylan, lost him, and immortalized him in song, but Rolling Thunder reminded her that their connection hadn't been erased by time. It was still there, fragile but real, preserved in the harmonies they could still summon. Each night, when their voices rose together, It was as if the audience was transported back to the early 60s, when a young woman with a crystalline voice had first taken a chance on a scrappy songwriter with nothing but a guitar and a dream. When the tour ended, so did their fragile reunion. Baez went back to her world, Dylan to his, and whatever closeness they had found on stage evaporated in everyday life. They would cross paths again in later years, sometimes in interviews, sometimes in documentaries, sometimes in brief appearances, but the intimacy of their early bond never returned. Rolling Thunder was their last true act together, a final encore, not of love, but of the musical magic that had first drawn them together. Looking back, Baez later described the experience with a mixture of fondness and resignation. She knew they were never meant to find their way back to each other in life, but in music, for a few fleeting months in the mid-70s, they had managed to bridge the gap. It was proof that while love may not last forever, some connections are eternal when sealed in song. When the Rolling Thunder review ended, so too did the last real chance for Joan Baez and Bob Dylan to reclaim what they had once shared. The whirlwind of performances had given audiences a glimpse of the old spark, but once the tour faded, reality returned. They went their separate ways again. Dylan into his ever-evolving career and myth, Baez into her steady path of activism and artistry. By then, it was clear, whatever had bound them together in the early 1960s wasn't coming back, and yet their story refused to end. Fans, journalists, and historians wouldn't let it. Decades later, their relationship still lingered in the public imagination, transformed into one of the great unfinished love stories in music history. Baez herself helped keep that story alive, though not out of bitterness. Over the years, she spoke about Dylan with a rare mix of honesty and grace. She admitted the pain of being cast aside, of sacrificing her own career momentum to support him, only to be left behind. She remembered the England tour and the cruel indifference that marked the end. She acknowledged the heartbreak that led her to write Diamonds and Rust, but she also chose forgiveness. "Bob was a big part of my life," she once said, "and I think I was a big part of his, but we were never meant to be together forever." It was a simple truth, delivered without drama, that showed how she had come to terms with the past. Dylan, true to form, rarely gave much away. When asked about Diamonds and Rust, he brushed it off with a faint smile, calling it a great song without admitting more. He never publicly reflected deeply on their relationship, and that silence only fed the myth. Fans interpreted his lack of comment in 1,000 ways. Some saw it as cruelty, others as mystery, still others as proof that he too had never truly let go. Whatever the case, Dylan's reticence only added to the aura that surrounded their story. As the decades passed, their relationship became a cultural touchstone. Biographers revisited it, documentaries analyzed it, films reimagined it. Each retelling offered a new lens. Dylan as the restless genius, Baez as the loyal muse, their bond as a symbol of the collision between art, love, and ambition in the 1960s. For younger generations, the story even found a modern label, a situationship. It resonated as a tale of two people drawn together by intensity but undone by timing, ambition, and incompatibility. To Gen Z, Joan Baez wasn't a tragic figure. She was a survivor who turned heartbreak into art and stood proudly on her own terms. The myth also gained power because of what Baez represented outside of Dylan. Unlike many women written into the footnotes of a man's story, she had her own towering legacy. She didn't disappear when Dylan moved on. She kept singing, kept marching, kept fighting for causes when the spotlight shifted elsewhere. To many, she became the conscience of folk music, the one who never wavered. That strength reframed her relationship with Dylan in hindsight. She wasn't just the woman who helped make him famous. She was the artist who turned his absence into a masterpiece and carried her convictions without compromise. In later interviews, Baez reflected on how the public often wanted to turn their story into a fairy tale or a tragedy, but she insisted it was neither. To her, it was simply a chapter, beautiful, painful, and transformative, but also finite. She chose to remember Dylan as both the diamond and the rust, to accept the contradictions instead of fighting them. That honesty made her words land more powerfully than any dramatized retelling ever could. Today, their bond lives on less as a personal relationship and more as part of the larger myth of the 1960s. Every time Diamonds and Rust plays, listeners are reminded of the cost of loving someone untamable. Every time footage of the March on Washington resurfaces, you can see them standing together, young and unbreakable, singing to change the world. And every time Dylan's electric set at Newport is discussed, Baez's quiet heartbreak is part of the story. In a way, their love was bigger than themselves. It became part of the cultural fabric of an era. And so, after the storm, what remained was not reconciliation, but memory. Not a fairy tale ending, but a legend that still sparks debate and fascination half a century later. They never found their way back to each other, but they never completely left each other's orbit either. That is the strange, enduring truth of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. A love unfinished, but immortal. Looking back now, the story of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan feels less like a romance and more like a legend etched into the DNA of modern music. It was never meant to be neat, never meant to end with tidy closure. Instead, it was messy, brilliant, painful, and unforgettable. The kind of love story that leaves scars but also shapes everything that comes after. Baez once said that Dylan was the greatest love of her life, but she also admitted he was the one who hurt her the most. That duality, diamond and rust, has defined how their story is remembered, not just by them, but by everyone who watched it unfold. Their legacy as a pair is larger than their personal relationship. Together, they embodied the spirit of the 1960s, rebellious, idealistic, unwilling to stay quiet in the face of injustice. When they sang side by side at the March on Washington, they weren't just two artists, they were voices of a movement, proof that music could be more than entertainment. It could be a weapon, a comfort, and a spark for change. When Dylan broke away, choosing reinvention over tradition, and when Baez stayed loyal to the cause, they came to represent two different roads out of that decade. One blazed forward into uncharted artistic territory, the other held firm to the ideals that gave the folk movement its soul. Neither path was wrong. Together, they tell the full story of a generation searching for meaning. But their romance, the part that fans still whisper about, adds a human layer to that history. It wasn't just about politics or music. It was about two people who fell in love at the center of a storm. They inspired each other, lifted each other, and in the end, wounded each other. The fact that their love didn't last doesn't make it less powerful. If anything, it makes it more relatable, because not every great love story ends with forever. Some end with silence, some end with a song. And in their case, the song, Diamonds and Rust, has outlived the relationship by decades, still echoing with every note the ache of what was lost and the beauty of what was shared. For Dylan, Baez was the woman who gave him his first big stage, the person who believed in him before the world did. For Baez, Dylan was the man who awakened both her heart and her heartbreak, shaping her music in ways she couldn't have imagined. Without him, she might never have written her most iconic song. Without her, he might never have reached audiences as quickly as he did. They made each other, even as they broke each other. That is the strange symmetry of their bond. So now the question turns to you. Was their relationship a beautiful but doomed love story, the kind that defines a lifetime but not a future? Or was it simply two artists colliding for a brief moment, only to drift apart once their work together was done? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about Joan and Bob's story. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of music history's most fascinating relationships, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about the legends who shaped our culture, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.